my oldest and longest standing ambition has always been, really since I was a child, to be a fiction writer, to be a novelist. I always thought that was, you know, the greatest thing. I've always loved fiction. I've always loved reading novels. But I suppose when I got to an age where I might actually start writing something, I didn't feel for a long time that I had anything to say, anything I was, you know, really kind of wanting to get out there, or the kind of creative abilities, really. And then I finally wrote a first book when I was doing work-life balance as you know, as a consultant, and I was commissioned to write a book on work-life balance, which was you know, an exciting new thing, a new idea at that point for a publisher. And they told me exactly what to write. They gave me a structure and they said, go away and just write this book. So I did, and it certainly wasn't the best book I've written, but I sort of, you know, I still felt that, you know, it wasn't really a creative piece of work. I loved writing. I wanted to be an author, but, you know, it wasn't exactly what I wanted. But actually that book turned me into a very successful consultant. It did a lot of good for my career, which actually meant that I could take some time off and go back to what I really had always wanted to do, which was write novels. So I started writing. I had just adopted a baby from a little girl from Russia, and I thought that was a really interesting area of writing. So I started writing a book called Blood and Water, as in which is thicker, because I also had two adult sons. No, they weren't adult then, but two teenage sons from previous marriage. So, you know, I had that sort of comparison, and I thought it was an interesting topic. So I thought, well, you know, I'm not going to be constrained in writing fiction like I was in my non-fiction book. I'm going to just, you know, let it flow, pour it out, do the kind of, you know, what is generally thought of as creative kind of writing. So I did. I wrote, you know, the best part of a manuscript, a first draft, and I was so pleased with it that I sent it to an agent, a writer's agent that I knew quite well, and I hoped that she would say, well, of course it's wonderful, I'll take it on. But unfortunately I got a letter back from her within a couple of weeks saying, Lucy, your book is both boring and unbelievable. Not things I wanted to hear at all. So I was kind of like, what? How can this be? How can it be unbelievable? This is part of my life. I've based this on reality. But she gave me a very salutary lesson. And she said to me, you know, real life is not the same as writing fiction. You actually need to plan and structure. And I thought, yes, you know, you're absolutely right. But not be structured like my first publisher had just given me a structure and said, go away and write it. I had to take ownership and really think about what structure meant to a reader, and what the reading process, especially a fiction, is. And it's not just, you know, as things flow into your head, it's all sort of, you know, it all just fits into place, because it doesn't. So I went back to my original story, I took it to pieces, and I created a very detailed plot structure. And I wrote a couple of chapters, and then work-life balance got in the way. I did feel inspired to do it, but I didn't really feel incredibly confident still. I showed it to a few friends who were all kind of quite complimentary, but I just left it there. And then what happened was I think probably about 5 years later, do you remember Richard and Judy, and how they started they have a fiction club, a novel club, and they started it with a competition for a new novel. And they asked, I think Macmillan were the sponsoring publisher, and they asked for anybody who wanted to could send in a contents page, a structure, and a first chapter, and they would choose the winner, and that winner would be published by Macmillan. So a few people who had read my, you know, my rewrite of my novel said, oh, send it in, go on, it's really good. And I thought, no, I really can't. But anyway, about the day before the entries closed, I thought, yes, I will send it in. Just, you know, why not? And I didn't hear anything by the closing date for entries. And when they said they were going to make a decision, sort of all passed by, and I thought, oh well, that's that. In fact, I didn't really think much about it at all. But then about 6 months after that, and funnily enough, it was actually the 1st of April, it was April Fool's Day, I got a letter I got in the post an envelope with Macmillan Publishers on it, and I literally nearly threw it away, because at that point, do you remember those book clubs where you could subscribe and publishers were always bombarding you with those? I thought it was one of those, but I did in fact open it, and it said, "Dear Lucy, thank you for submitting your idea to the Richard and Judy novel competition. It didn't win, and I thought, well, no, I didn't expect it to, but thank you for writing anyway." But they said it was one of 10 other novels apart from the winner that we really liked, and we are interested in publishing. Can you send me the rest? So that was like, sort of, oh, wonderful, but there is no rest. So I literally took 3 months off, wrote my novel, wrote the rest of the novel. I got a friend of mine who's an editor to work on it with me, so I wasn't on my own, and I got other people to read it, and I eventually sent it into Macmillan, and they published it. So that was that was my story of a kind of a journey through creativity, from thinking everything creative has to be very free flowing, to being completely at the other end of the sort of scale and thinking, no, actually a lot of creativity is about planning and structure.
So many interesting things that you've touched on there, Lucy. So first of all, this process of creativity, obviously it begins with imagination, with some ideas initially, but as you say, to go from that phase of imagination to creativity, it requires a lot of preparation, it requires a lot of planning. And in your book, How to Write Fiction Without Fuss, you talk about, you have like a very long chapter on all the things that a writer needs to do to prepare. For example, the outline, the themes, the research that needs to go into it. But for a book to go to the phase of creativity, there needs to be a phase. In your book, you finish at the stage of actually publishing your book. But as you know, nowadays, so many people can self-publish a book, but it's not necessarily creative. It's not creative if no one buys that book, if it makes no impact, if the only people who read that book are, the writer's family and friends, and perhaps even they need some encouragement to do it. So in order for a book to make an impact and to be creative, there needs to be something which distinguishes it. When you entered the Richard and Judy competition, I think in your book you say there were 47,000 competitors.
That's what they told me, yes. So there must have been a lot of awfully bad ones.
But maybe they were and maybe they weren't. But the fact is that your idea was selected out of thousands. Now, creativity researchers such as Mihai Csikszentmihalyi would say, well, you fulfilled the criterion of that social evaluation. For something to go from merely an idea or imagination, for it to go to the stage of being labeled creative, it needs to go through this process of social evaluation. Like Macmillan's, the publishers, they chose your work. So what would you say to those other 47,000 who had their ideas, maybe they had like really rich imaginations or whatever, but their ideas were not selected? So does that mean for you that actually we can't really say that, the rest of the 47,000 were creative because they were not read?
No, I don't think I would make that same link between creativity and the fact that it's something is commercially or socially accepted or published in this case. I think that, I mean, if you think about it, a lot of authors are not successful in those terms in their lifetime, for instance, but maybe later. Some authors, I mean, like Gerald Manley Hopkins, wasn't even published in his lifetime, but was later seen to be an extremely creative poet. So I don't know that the sort of commercial aspect of it, which and the success in that sort of sense, is necessarily to do with creativity. I mean, I suspect what I meant when I said that some of the entries were really bad is that they possibly weren't written well. They weren't necessarily not creative. And I think there's a difference between having creative ideas and being able to put them into an acceptable form for whoever is the gatekeeper of the art form or the creative form that you're aspiring to. And some are, much harder to find a commercial, outlet for than others. I mean, I think poetry is probably one of the most difficult at the moment, fiction easier, but still, to get that external approbation, if you like, from publishers, harder. But as you say, you can publish your own, and a lot of self-published authors then do go on to be extremely successful because they manage to publicize themselves well, or occasionally people just find their work and love it. So I think creativity is not necessarily the same thing as success.
So how do you define creativity? Because the way Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and other academics define creativity is that it needs to fulfill two criteria. It needs to have value, be useful in some way, and it needs to be original. It needs to be innovative in some way. So those 47,000 who submitted their entries, but they weren't selected, can we say that their ideas are valuable, that they're original if they weren't selected?
I think they might have been, and who knows, some of them, I mean, I don't, 47,000 is an awful lot, so probably on the balance of probability, not all of them were creative, and perhaps, an awful lot of them weren't expressed in a form in which the arbiters of success were prepared to read them. So, I mean, I don't know that I would say that creativity necessarily has to find that external validation. I'm not sure I'd agree that that was necessarily the case. I think you can be creative and yet not actually find an outlet or an audience for your creativity. That doesn't necessarily mean you're not creative.
Yeah, so again, it goes back to how do we actually define creativity, because some people define it as like the little c creativity and the big C creativity, and big C creativity needs to make an impact, whereas little c creativity, well, even a flower arrangement, we can say it's creative because it's pleasing and it's useful for, it's aesthetically beautiful and it adds value to our living room because we've got a nice beautiful creation there. But we all have ideas, and perhaps every day we have hundreds of ideas, and most of them are not going to be useful neither to ourselves nor to anyone else. So how do we distinguish between ideas that are useful and ideas which are not? How do we sort out the wheat from the chaff, as it were?
I think it's a very difficult one, and I think creativity is such a broad thing that it's. I mean, I think we think of creativity often as something artistic, but it's not always just artistic. Creativity can come in all sorts of. I mean, it certainly can come in science, and as I've later discovered, it can come in business as well. So I suppose. The outcomes it has are important, and but I think you can be sort of pointlessly creative in that you can have these ideas, and I still think they can be assessed as creative. I think you can believe that they are creative, even if some of them, maybe the vast majority of the ideas or the the creative thoughts that you have come to absolutely nothing because you simply can't pursue every idea that you have. So I'm not sure that I agree with Csikszentmihalyi's definition of creativity as having a social or an artistic use. I think creativity is something, you know, that's internal to people. It's not necessarily, you know, something that has to have an external validation.
Yeah.
I suppose, though, that whether, you know, there may be lots of people writing away in the privacy of their own home and creating things that haven't been created before. I mean, they may not be writing, they may be painting or drawing or sculpting or singing, or, but the fact that it doesn't have an audience and doesn't produce a result, or you know, is not seen as useful in some way, I still, you know, I would, I don't like the idea that that's still not creative work or creative thinking. I think that, I mean, I suppose I would return to my earlier point that that in creativity, a lot of it is based around having a good structure. It's not just about content, whether that's, you know, a wonderful idea for a painting or a novel or whatever else, or a business come to that. But if you don't have the structure, I think perhaps that is where that's where creativity fails to reach an outcome and a result. And perhaps that's what I'm saying, really, that if you actually want to, if you want your creativity, your creative impulse to have that sort of effect, and some people really literally don't, they just want to do what they do and don't care about whether it has an audience or a market or a result. But I think if you do want that, then structure is a very important part of understanding how creativity is received by other people rather than just within your own head.
The importance of packaging, I suppose, isn't it?
I suppose that's one way of putting it, yes.